Most people think they know what capitalism is built on: free markets, minimal government, the idea that if everyone just pursues their own interests, society will magically sort itself out. And if you ask where that idea came from, you'll hear the same answer every time: Adam Smith, the man with the powdered wig, the father of economics, the prophet of laissez-faire. But here's the problem: Adam Smith never believed in the version of capitalism that quotes him today. In fact, the people who worship his name are often the exact people he warned us about. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Before we talk about the invisible hand, we need to go back a step, because most people have never actually heard what Smith stood for, and that's not their fault. For the past century, an entire economic mythology has been built using Smith's name, a mythology so widespread that it feels like common sense. It goes like this: government should stay out of the economy, markets should run freely, and competition will naturally create prosperity for everyone. Economists later called this idea laissez-faire, a French phrase meaning let it be, or more accurately, hands off. The story says Adam Smith invented laissez-faire, that he believed markets should be left alone to operate without interference, that he trusted greed more than government, that he thought unregulated commerce was the purest form of human progress. It's a neat story, simple, clean, ideological, but it has one small issue. Adam Smith never said any of that, not once. In fact, if Adam Smith saw what modern capitalism calls free markets, he would probably ask who rewrote his book and why they left out all the warnings. So let's return to the real world of Adam Smith, not the one taught in convenient slogans, but the one the man himself lived in. Smith was born in 1723 in Scotland, a place defined by harsh winters, limited opportunity, and a society where birth mattered far more than talent. Britain at the time was not a land of free markets. It was a mercantilist empire. Trade was controlled by royal monopolies. Prices were controlled by guilds. Industries were dominated by cartels. And global commerce was controlled by massive corporations like the East India Company, which had its own private army, and behaved less like a business and more like a sovereign power. This was the world Smith studied. A world where economic power and political power were deeply entangled, where markets did not operate freely but were shaped, influenced, and often rigged by private interests. If anything, Smith spent most of his life warning that when merchants gain too much influence, they will use it to manipulate the rules in their favor. He wrote that people of the same trade seldom meet together, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. Translation: whenever businessmen get together, society loses. It's not exactly the motto of unregulated capitalism. And here's another truth the textbooks conveniently skip. Adam Smith was not trained as an economist. He didn't even consider himself one. He was a moral philosopher, someone who studied human behavior, empathy, sympathy, and the psychology behind why we treat each other fairly or don't. Long before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a dense philosophical book about human morality. And if you read that book, really read it, you understand immediately that Smith believed societies only work when people behave with some sense of decency and mutual responsibility. He didn't believe greed drives the world. He believed morality does, which leads us to the biggest twist in Smith's entire legacy, the invisible hand. It's the phrase everyone knows, even if they don't know where it came from. The idea that the market, left alone, somehow guides society to a better outcome. But here's the part that modern capitalism buries. Smith used the phrase only 3 times across everything he ever wrote. 3. And not one of those uses describes a universal law of markets. Not one of them says, let corporations run free, everything will fix itself. Not one of them says, deregulation is the path to prosperity. But if the invisible hand wasn't the core of Smith's philosophy, what was? It was his belief that economies work only when power is dispersed and rules are enforced. He supported government intervention in education, banking, public works, natural monopolies, infrastructure, and the prevention of corporate capture. He believed in regulation, just not stupid regulation. And he spent page after page warning about corporations becoming too powerful, too political, and too entrenched. Smith's world was dominated by the East India Company, a corporation with a monopoly so vast it controlled territories, armies, and trade routes. Smith called it a blood-stained monopoly, a destructive force that distorted markets and corrupted governments. If he were alive today, he would look at certain modern tech giants, pharmaceutical conglomerates, and financial institutions, and probably ask one question: did no one read the book? The strange and slightly darkly comedic part of all this is that Adam Smith has become the mascot of an ideology he explicitly warned against. It's the intellectual equivalent of a company stealing the identity of the man who criticized them. To understand what Adam Smith actually meant, you have to begin with a strange fact. The invisible hand barely appears in his work at all. 3 uses: 2 in his published books, 1 in an early essay. And none of these uses talk about free markets fixing themselves. None describe the market as a self-regulating force. None can be stretched into the modern idea that greed magically produces social harmony. If anything, the 3 uses show the opposite. Smith believed the invisible hand was the exception, not the rule, a rare moment when human behavior accidentally produces a positive outcome. Not a law of economics, but a footnote on human imperfection. The first use appears in the History of Astronomy, a curious little essay Smith wrote before he became famous. Here, the invisible hand refers to ancient superstition, the human tendency to attribute unexplained events to the gods. It has nothing to do with markets or money. It's Smith, the philosopher, observing how people create comforting stories to make sense of chaos. If modern capitalism wanted a metaphor for itself, that one might actually be more accurate. But no one quotes that one, for obvious reasons. The second use, the famous one, appears in The Wealth of Nations, but even here, the context gets conveniently erased. Smith describes a merchant who prefers investing domestically because he fears the risks of foreign trade. Not because he is patriotic, rational, or economically enlightened, because he is scared. Fear, Smith says, pushes him toward a decision that unintentionally benefits domestic industry. That's it. Not a law of economics, not a universal principle, just a moment where private fear accidentally creates a public benefit. But when later economists needed a slogan to justify deregulation, they transformed that single anecdote into a divine law. If irony had a patron saint, he would probably look a lot like Adam Smith watching people misread his book. The third and final use appears in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and this one is even more revealing. Smith complains that wealthy landowners, who live like vain and insatiable beasts, his words, hoard resources, but end up distributing some of their wealth simply because they can't consume it all themselves. They don't share out of kindness, they share out of physical limitations. A man can own 10,000 acres, but he can only eat 1 dinner, so the poor survive on leftovers. That is the invisible hand in the moral sense. The rich accidentally feeding the poor because gluttony has boundaries. It's hardly a love letter to inequality. It's more like a morally exhausted sigh that even the selfish must, at some point, accidentally let go of a crumb. Put simply, Smith's 3 invisible hands are superstition, fear, and the physical limits of gluttony. Not exactly the holy trinity of neoliberal economics, and yet across the 20th century that tiny metaphor took on a life of its own. Economists from the Chicago School, policymakers from the Reagan era, corporate lobbyists and pro-market think tanks elevated the invisible hand into a doctrine. They framed it as proof that regulation was unnecessary, that government was inherently harmful, and that markets, if left alone, would naturally create stability. The invisible hand transformed from a metaphor into a mandate, a tool not for understanding markets, but for arguing against rules. Adam Smith became the intellectual mascot of deregulation, even though he spent half his career warning that merchants, when left unchecked, would distort markets to enrich themselves. This reinterpretation wasn't accidental. It was strategic. As industrial giants emerged in the late 1800s and early 1900s, railroads, steel companies, oil barons, they needed a philosophical justification for power. Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller didn't want regulation. They wanted legitimacy. So they found it in a simplified version of Smith. Later, the Cold War turned that simplified version into a weapon. Capitalism needed a moral narrative to oppose communism, and Smith's invisible hand, stripped of all nuance, became that narrative. It was marketed not as an observation, but as a universal law, a law that conveniently benefited those in charge of the system. What Smith actually feared, though, was exactly what the 20th century created. Corporations so large that they could set prices, influence laws, and overpower nations. He warned that merchants, when left alone, would deceive and oppress the public. He cautioned that monopolies would destroy competition. He argued that governments must intervene to prevent market distortions, protect workers, and maintain fairness. But the people who claimed Smith as their champion ignored those parts. Their version of Smith was simplified, sanitized, and stripped of moral philosophy. All the warnings were deleted, all the nuance erased, all the uncomfortable truths buried. It's a pattern we've seen throughout history. Powerful groups take the one sentence that benefits them and leave the rest behind. They quote the invisible hand, but not the part where Smith condemns corporations. They praise his belief in markets, but ignore his outrage at inequality. They elevate the free market, but forget that Smith viewed markets as a human creation, not a natural force, and therefore something that requires rules, oversight, and moral boundaries. And here's the twist modern policymakers avoid. Smith never believed individuals acting in their own interest would reliably produce good outcomes. He believed they would often produce terrible ones. The whole purpose of Wealth of Nations was to reveal why markets fail, how monopolies form, how cartels manipulate prices, how corporations corrupt governments, and how economic power concentrates. The invisible hand wasn't the cure, it was the anomaly. But over the centuries, the anomaly became the brand. If you fast forward from Adam Smith's world to ours, the irony is almost painful. We built an entire economic system on a sentence that Smith barely used, and ignored the hundreds of pages where he warned about everything we face today. Concentrated power, corporate influence over government, markets distorted not by regulation, but by those wealthy enough to write the rules. Every crisis of the last century, from the Great Depression to the 2008 collapse, traces back to the same pattern Smith predicted. When the most powerful players move in the shadows, the market stops being a market. It becomes a stage, and the rest of us are just paying for the tickets. Look at the modern landscape. Tech giants that shape information, retail monopolies that crush competition, financial institutions whose failures require national bailouts. These aren't free markets. These are cartels with better PR. And the strange comfort policymakers take in invoking the invisible hand, as if it were a cosmic safety net, feels less like economics and more like superstition. It's the same belief Smith criticized in his first use of the metaphor, the human need to imagine invisible forces doing the work we don't want to do ourselves. The truth is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Markets don't magically correct abuse. Power doesn't regulate itself. And greed, left alone, consumes everything in its path, including the system that rewards it. The modern version of capitalism has become the exact creature Smith feared most, a world where the few can tilt the board so effectively that the market's outcomes look like destiny rather than design. But understanding what Smith actually meant doesn't make the world darker. It makes it clearer. Because Smith didn't believe the economy was doomed. He believed it was human, flawed, fixable, and shaped by choices. What he really argued for was balance. Markets strong enough to innovate, governments strong enough to restrain, and societies wise enough to demand fairness. Smith never promised that the invisible hand would save us. He argued that we had to save ourselves. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.